Hey guys, before we start, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can, settle into your blankets, let your eyes get heavy. If you're new here, a quiet like or subscribe helps this channel grow, and I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. No need to type it now, just let it cross your mind. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's slip back 2,000 years, into the streets of ancient Rome. We like to imagine the Romans as gleaming marble and polished virtue, men in white togas, standing tall beneath a spotless sun. But that image, the one carved into museum busts and history textbooks, hides something far more human, far messier, and far more interesting. Rome smelled. It smelled of sweat, of smoke, of animals crowded into narrow streets, of rivers thick with refuse. It smelled of perfume applied thickly to cover what soap could not. The Romans were not the pristine people we picture, they were a civilization wrestling, day after day, with the same stubborn problem every crowded city has faced since the beginning of time. What do you do with 1 million bodies, all breathing, sweating, and living on top of each other? And yet, here is the strange part, the Romans cared about cleanliness. Deeply. Obsessively, even. They built some of the most advanced water systems the ancient world had ever seen. Aqueducts stretched for miles, carrying fresh water down from distant hills into the heart of the city. Sewers ran beneath the streets, carrying waste away in the dark. Public baths rose on nearly every corner, vast marble halls where citizens gathered daily, not just to wash, but to talk, to trade gossip, to feel, for an hour, like the world was theirs. So which is it? Were the Romans clean, or were they filthy? The uncomfortable truth is, both. At once. Cleanliness in Rome was not what we would recognize today. There was no soap as we know it, no daily shower, no toothbrush waiting by a basin each morning. Instead, there were oils, and scrapers, and communal water shared by strangers. There were toilets without privacy, sponges passed from hand to hand, and public spaces where the boundary between clean and unclean blurred in ways that would unsettle a modern visitor. Picture a wealthy senator, freshly oiled and scraped smooth after an afternoon at the baths, stepping out into a street where the gutter runs thick with waste from the tannery next door. Picture a woman lighting incense in her home, not for ceremony, but simply to mask the smell drifting in from the crowded insula next door, where a dozen families share a single latrine down the hall. This was Rome. Beautiful and squalid, ordered and chaotic, all at once, all together, all breathing the same warm Mediterranean air. Understanding Roman hygiene means letting go of the marble-white fantasy. It means walking instead through narrow alleys where laundry hangs overhead, dripping faintly onto the cobblestones below, where the scent of bread mixes with the scent of the tannery, where a slave carries water up for flights of stairs because the wealthy rarely carry anything themselves. It means understanding that for the Romans, hygiene was never simply about a body being clean. It was about ritual, about community, about status, about the quiet daily performance of being a citizen of the greatest city in the known world, even when the world beneath your sandals told a messier story. Over the next several chapters, we will step slowly through this hidden Rome, the baths, the toilets, the oils, the sponges, the sewers below the streets, and the strange, sometimes startling truths of how an empire kept itself, more or less, clean. But for now, just breathe. Let the noise of the modern world fade, and let yourself sink into the quiet hum of an ancient city, still stirring somewhere in the folds of history, waiting patiently for you to drift off before it fully wakes. The city stirs slowly, the way a body wakes before the mind fully catches up. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window, a rooster calls out over the rooftops, and the first pale light begins to creep along the tiled edges of the insula. Inside, on a narrow straw mattress, a man named, let's simply call him a baker's apprentice, opens his eyes to another day in the world's greatest city. He does not reach for water to wash his face. There is no basin waiting, no ritual splash to greet the morning. Water is heavy, and water is work, carried up flights of narrow stairs by someone's aching arms, so it is not spent carelessly on something as small as a face. Instead, he rubs his eyes, runs a hand through his hair, and reaches for yesterday's tunic, still faintly damp from the humidity that never quite leaves a Roman apartment. Breakfast, if it can be called that, is small. A heel of bread, perhaps dipped in a little wine to soften it, eaten standing, already half out the door. There is no lingering over meals in the morning. Time in Rome moves with the sun, and the sun does not wait for anyone, wealthy or poor. Down in the street, the real washing of the day begins, not with soap and basin, but with motion itself. Walking through the crowded lanes stirs the blood, and sweat, more than dirt, is what most Romans considered the real enemy of a pleasant day. The heat clings early, even in the cooler months, and by mid-morning, most bodies are already glistening faintly beneath their tunics. For an ordinary Roman, true cleansing waits for later, for the baths, that great communal ritual that punctuates the day like a second sunrise. But morning is not for lingering in warm water. Morning is for the fountain at the corner of the street, where a dozen households gather with clay jugs, filling them from a public spout fed by the aqueducts stretching invisibly overhead like veins beneath the skin of the city. Here, at the fountain, something almost tender happens. Neighbors trade a few words while they wait their turn. An old woman complains about her joints. A young mother balances a child on her hip while filling 2 jugs at once. A soldier home on leave splashes cool water briefly across the back of his neck before continuing on. It is not a bath. It is barely a wash. But it is enough, for now, to feel human before the heat of the day fully arrives. The apprentice fills his own small jug, more for drinking than washing, and continues on toward the bakery where he works, past shop fronts opening their shutters, past the metallic clang of a smith already hard at work, past the sweet, heavy smell of bread rising in ovens further down the street, his destination. Hygiene, in this early hour, has little to do with scrubbing skin. It is about staying upright, staying fed, staying moving. Dirt collects slowly through the day, gathering on hands and feet and clothing, an accumulation that will be dealt with later, at the baths, in the way Romans have always dealt with such things, not through constant small corrections, but through one long, deliberate ritual each afternoon. For now, the apprentice's hands are already dusted faintly with flour before he has even touched a single loaf. Flour that will mix with sweat and street dust by midday, forming the kind of everyday griminess that every Roman citizen, from senator to slave, silently accepted as simply the cost of being alive in a living, breathing, overcrowded city. He glances briefly toward the horizon, where the sun climbs higher above the terracotta rooftops, and quickens his pace. There is bread to bake, water to fetch, a whole day of small labors ahead, and somewhere in the hours to come, the promise of warm water and quiet company, waiting at the baths like an old friend he has not yet learned to take for granted. By the time the sun leans westward, softening from harsh white to a deeper gold, something shifts across the city. Shop fronts begin to close. Hammers fall silent in the workshops. And through the winding streets, a quiet migration begins toward the baths. If you asked a Roman what they looked forward to most in a day, the answer would rarely be food, and rarely be sleep. It would be this, the hour, sometimes two, spent inside the walls of the bathhouse, where the worries of commerce and status and dust dissolved, however briefly, into steam. To call the baths merely a place to get clean would miss the point entirely. Yes, bodies were washed there. But the baths were something closer to a second home. A place where a senator and a shopkeeper might, for a fleeting hour, occupy the same warm room, breathe the same humid air, and speak almost as equals. In a city so sharply divided by wealth and birth, the bathhouse was one of the rare spaces where the lines blurred. Picture the entrance to grand doorway, sometimes modest, sometimes as ornate as a temple, depending on which baths a person could afford or which the emperor had chosen to build for the people. Inside, mosaic floors stretched beneath bare feet, cool at first, until the deeper rooms warmed them. Voices echoed off high ceilings, laughter, gossip, the splash of water, the low murmur of business deals struck between old friends who had not seen each other since the last visit. For a small fee, often barely more than a coin, anyone could enter. Slaves, freedmen, merchants, senators, all passed through the same doors, though rarely at the same hour. Certain times of day belonged to certain classes, certain baths catered to certain neighborhoods, and the wealthy sometimes built private baths within their own villas to avoid the crowd altogether. But for the vast majority of Romans, this daily ritual was communal, unavoidable, and deeply looked forward to. The appeal ran deeper than warmth and water. In a world without private telephones, without written invitations delivered by messenger for every small gathering, the bath served as the city's living newsroom. Here, a merchant might learn of a shipment delayed at port before it reached the forum's official notices. Here, political rumors drifted from ear to ear faster than any scroll could carry them. Here, marriages were quietly arranged between fathers soaking side by side, business partnerships sealed with nothing more than a nod and a shared cup of watered wine. There was also, beneath all this, something simpler: relief. Relief from labor, from heat, from the grinding sameness of a long day. A dock worker, arms aching from hauling crates since dawn, could step into the baths and, for a little while, feel the same warm water against his skin as a magistrate fresh from a morning of court proceedings. The empire outside might be built on rigid hierarchy, but the water inside made no such distinctions. Children ran along the edges of courtyards while their mothers exchanged news near the shallow pools. Old men debated philosophy in low voices near the warmest rooms, where the heat eased aching joints better than any physician's remedy. Somewhere, a masseur worked oil into the shoulders of a tired laborer, his hands moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. As the light outside faded further, oil lamps were lit along the corridors, casting a soft amber glow across damp mosaic floors. The noise softened too, conversations lowering to a murmur as the day's exhaustion finally caught up with even the most talkative visitors. This was not simply hygiene. This was Rome's quiet, universal comfort, the one part of the day where everyone, regardless of birth, allowed themselves to simply exist, unhurried, warm, and briefly, wonderfully equal, and tucked into the far end of nearly every bathhouse complex. Behind a heavier door and thicker walls, waited the true heart of the ritual, the caldarium, the hot room, where the real transformation of the day was about to begin. Beyond the heavier door, the air changes first. It thickens, grows warm against the skin before the eyes even adjust to the dim, steam-softened light. This is the caldarium, the hot room, and stepping into it feels less like entering a building and more like stepping into the exhale of something ancient and alive. The walls here are lined with a kind of quiet engineering most visitors never think to question. Beneath the floor, hidden from view, a network of hollow spaces called the hypercourse channels heat from a furnace tended by unseen slaves, warming the stone from below until even the floor itself radiates a gentle heat through the soles of bare feet. It is, in its own way, one of the great hidden marvels of the ancient world. Central heating, centuries before anyone in Rome would have thought to call it that. A merchant lowers himself onto a heated stone bench, exhaling slowly as the warmth works into muscles stiffened from a day bent over ledgers and grain sacks. Sweat begins to bead almost immediately, not from exertion, but from the sheer saturating heat of the room, thick with moisture that clings to every surface, every breath, every murmured word exchanged between bathers seated nearby. This sweating is not incidental. It is, in fact, the entire point. Without soap as we would recognize it, heat becomes the first tool of cleansing, opening pores, loosening the grime accumulated through a long day of labor. Dust and city air. The body, quite literally, begins to release what the morning's brief fountain splash could never fully wash away. From the caldarium, a bather might move next to the tepidarium, a warm but gentler room, meant as a resting point, a place to acclimate before facing cooler waters ahead. Here, the pace slows further. Conversations continue, softer now, unhurried, the kind of talk that only happens when bodies have stopped rushing and minds have finally caught up to the slower rhythm of the room, and then, finally, the frigidarium, the cold plunge. Even seasoned bathers sometimes hesitate here, gathering themselves before stepping into water kept deliberately, bracingly cool. The shock of it closes the pores again, tightens the skin, and leaves a strange, invigorating clarity behind, the kind that seems to sharpen thought as much as it refreshes the body. Around these three central rooms, smaller chambers branch outward like rooms in a quiet, sprawling home. An exercise yard, where younger men wrestle or toss a ball beneath open sky before their bath, working up the very sweat the caldarium will later draw out more fully. A library, in the grandest of complexes, where scrolls wait on shelves for those who prefer contemplation to conversation. Small shops selling oils and scented balms, their scents mixing faintly with steam and stone. Attendants move quietly between rooms, some carrying fresh linen, others tending to the fires below that keep the entire complex breathing with warmth. This is a labor rarely noticed by the bathers above. Yet without it, the whole elaborate ritual would collapse into cold stone and silence. By early evening, the rooms grow fuller, voices layering over one another in a low, comfortable hum. A father brings his young son for the first time, guiding him gently from room to room, teaching him without words the rhythm every Roman eventually learns by heart: heat, then warmth, then cold, then rest. Outside, the city continues its business, indifferent to the hour. But here, within these thick walls, time moves differently, measured not by the sun's position but by the slow progression from one room's temperature to the next, a private clock understood only by those who have learned to surrender to it. As the last light filters faintly through the high windows above the frigidarium, casting pale streaks across the rippling water, one truth settles quietly over the room, that for all Rome's engineering marvels, its roads and its aqueducts and its towering monuments, perhaps none served its people quite so intimately, quite so gently, as this. There is a question that lingers, quiet and persistent, beneath everything we have seen so far. If the Romans had no soap as we know it, no bottle to pour, no bar to lather, then how, precisely, did they get clean at all? The answer waits patiently in the warm rooms of the bathhouse, in a method so different from our own that it might seem, at first, almost unrecognizable as washing. Imagine the merchant from before, still seated in the caldarium, his skin now slick with sweat drawn out by the heat. He does not reach for water and cloth. Instead, an attendant approaches carrying a small clay flask, its contents thick and golden, olive oil, warmed slightly, poured carefully across the shoulders and arms. The oil spreads slowly, coating the skin in a thin, glistening layer. It is worked in gently, sometimes by the bather's own hands, sometimes by a slave trained specifically for this purpose, fingers pressing the oil into skin already loosened and softened by heat. This is not indulgence for its own sake, though it certainly feels that way. The oil serves a purpose far more practical than luxury alone. As the oil settles into the skin, it begins to bind with the accumulated dirt, sweat, and dead skin that no amount of water alone could lift away. Where a modern bather might reach for soap to dissolve grime, the Roman relied instead on this careful combination: heat to open the pores, oil to draw the dirt to the surface, and something else entirely to finish the job. That something waits in the attendant's other hand, a curved metal instrument, slightly rounded at its edge, known as a strigil. But its story deserves its own careful telling, one we will turn to shortly, in full. For now, picture simply the sensation of the oil itself, still spreading warm across tired shoulders, the merchant's eyes closing briefly as the attendant's steady hands move in slow, practiced strokes. There is something almost meditative in it, a stillness that settles over the entire caldarium as bathers around him undergo the same quiet ritual, room filled with the soft, wet sound of oil meeting skin, punctuated occasionally by a low murmur of conversation or a contented exhale. Not every Roman could afford an attendant's skilled hands, of course. In more modest households, or among those unable to visit the grander baths, oil might simply be applied by one's own hands, or by a spouse, a sibling, a neighbor sharing the same small basin. The wealthy might use finer oils, scented with rose or myrrh imported from distant provinces, while the poor may do with simpler, plainer olive oil, pressed locally and stored in humble clay jars. Regardless of station, the principle remained the same across the entire breadth of Roman society. Cleanliness was not something scrubbed away with friction and lather, as we might understand it today, but something drawn out, coaxed gently from the skin through warmth and oil, a slower, more patient process entirely. There is something worth sitting with here, in this quiet difference between their methods and ours. We think of washing as an act of removal, scrubbing something unwanted away in seconds beneath a rushing tap. For the Romans, washing was closer to a conversation with the body, first warming it, then anointing it, then finally, carefully, releasing what no longer belonged. The merchant shifts slightly on the heated bench as the attendant finishes working oil across his back, the golden sheen now covering nearly every visible inch of skin. Around him, the room continues its low hum of activity, other bathers in various stages of the same unhurried process, some just beginning, oil still cool against their shoulders. Others nearly finished, skin glistening under the dim amber light filtering through steam. Outside, evening continues its slow descent over the city, but here, wrapped in warmth and oil and quiet company, time moves at its own gentler pace. And soon, that curved metal instrument will complete what oil and heat have started, scraping away the last remnants of a long day, leaving behind skin that feels, however briefly, entirely new. The instrument itself is unremarkable to look at first glance. A curved strip of bronze, sometimes iron, sometimes even silver for those who could afford such things, shaped like a shallow crescent moon, with a handle worn smooth by countless hands before it. This is the strigil, and though it holds no beauty of its own, it performs, quite possibly, the single most essential act in the entire Roman washing ritual. The merchant, still glistening with oil from the attendant's careful hands, now turned slightly, offering his forearm. The attendant lifts the strigil and, with a motion practiced over years of repetition, draws its curved edge along the skin in a single, smooth stroke. What comes away is not simply oil. It is oil mixed with sweat, with dust from the street, with the fine grime that settles invisibly onto skin throughout a long day, all of it gathered now into a thin grey residue clinging to the strigil's curved blade. The attendant flicks it aside with a practiced twist of the wrist, and draws the instrument along the skin once more. There is a rhythm to this that becomes almost hypnotic to watch. Stroke, flick, stroke, flick, moving steadily along the arm, across the shoulders, down the back, each pass revealing skin slightly cleaner than the last, slightly more his own again, freed from the accumulated weight of the day. The Romans called this process strigillation, and it was considered, by most accounts, more essential to true cleanliness than the oil or water that preceded it. For the wealthy, this scraping was performed by an attendant, sometimes a slave trained specifically in the delicate art of strigil work, skilled enough to clean thoroughly without scratching or bruising the skin beneath. For the less fortunate, it was often done alone, twisting awkwardly to reach one's own back, or trading the favor with a friend, each scraping the other's shoulders in a small act of mutual care that asked for nothing in return but the same service given back. There was, notably, a particular affection among Roman athletes for this ritual. After wrestling or running in the exercise yards attached to the baths, their bodies would be coated deliberately in a fine layer of dust or sand, meant to improve grip during competition. This dust, mixed later with sweat and oil, created a thick residue that only a strigil could properly remove, scraped away in long, satisfying strokes that left the skin beneath feeling remarkably renewed. Some of these strigils were plain, functional tools meant purely for daily use. Others, particularly those belonging to wealthier citizens, were elaborately decorated, engraved with patterns of vines or small mythological scenes, sometimes even inscribed with the owner's name, as though the object itself deserved to be remembered alongside its owner. Physicians of the time occasionally weighed in on proper strigil technique, suggesting the direction and pressure of each stroke could affect not just cleanliness, but circulation and overall vitality. Some believed vigorous scraping stimulated the body's humors, aiding digestion and easing tension in tired muscles, blending what we might now separate into hygiene and medicine into a single, unified practice. The used oil and residue collected from strigils, called strigmentum, found its own strange afterlife beyond the baths. Some believed it held medicinal properties, and it was occasionally collected and sold, used in ointments meant to treat everything from joint pain to skin ailments. A curious reminder that little in Roman life, even the grime scraped from a stranger's back, went entirely to waste. As the attendant finishes the final strokes along the merchant's legs, the strigil set aside now, glinting faintly in the dim light, something in the merchant's posture shifts. His shoulders drop slightly, the tension of the day finally loosened along with the dirt that clung to it. His skin, still faintly warm from the caldarium, feels smooth now beneath his own fingertips, entirely his own again. Around him, the soft metallic scrape of other strigils continues its quiet rhythm through the steam-filled room, an unhurried percussion accompanying the low murmur of conversation. Each stroke another small release, another small return to something clean, something renewed, something ready, finally, for whatever the cooler waters ahead might bring. Not every scent that drifted through the streets of Rome was unwelcome. Beneath the smoke and the sweat and the animal musk that clung to the crowded lanes, there existed a whole separate world, one built entirely around fragrance, one where oils and perfumes served as both luxury and quiet necessity, a way of reclaiming something pleasant amid the city's overwhelming press of bodies. It is worth pausing here on a small but persistent misunderstanding. Soap, as it happens, was not entirely unknown to the ancient world. Travelers and traders occasionally brought word, and even samples, of a substance used by certain Gallic and Germanic tribes to the north, a crude mixture of animal fat and ash that lathered when mixed with water. The Romans knew of it, wrote about it, even imported small quantities from time to time. But they largely dismissed it, considering the oil and strigil method already perfected through centuries of refinement, far superior to this foreign curiosity. What the Romans embraced instead, wholeheartedly, was oil, in all its many forms. Plain olive oil served the everyday citizen well enough, pressed locally, stored in unadorned clay vessels, purchased cheaply at the market alongside bread and wine. But for those with the means to seek something finer, an entire industry existed, quiet and fragrant, dedicated to transforming this humble base into something closer to art. Picture a small shop tucked along a side street near the Forum. Its interior dim and cool, shelves lined with rows of narrow glass and clay bottles, each stoppered carefully against the heat outside. A perfumer here, an unguentarius, spends his days blending oils infused with rose petals gathered before dawn, when their fragrance runs strongest, or with crushed iris root, or delicate saffron threads imported at considerable expense from distant provinces. Some scents leaned heavily floral, rose and violet mingling in a single blend meant to evoke the freshness of a spring garden even in the height of a Roman summer. Others turned earthier, deeper, myrrh and frankincense, the same resins burned in temples, now pressed instead into oils meant for the body, carrying with them a faint suggestion of the sacred into everyday life. The wealthy did not simply apply these oils after bathing, as the merchant had earlier in the caldarium. Fine perfumed oils became a form of quiet display, a way of announcing status without a single word spoken. A woman attending a dinner party might wear a scent so distinct, so carefully composed, that guests could recognize her presence in a room before ever seeing her face. Drifting in ahead of her like a soft, fragrant herald, men, too, embraced perfume without the hesitation later centuries would impose on such things. A senator might carry a small vial tucked into his toga, dabbing scented oil onto his wrists before an important meeting, believing, as many did, that a pleasant fragrance carried its own subtle authority, a way of commanding a room through the senses as much as through words. Yet perfume in Rome was never entirely free from suspicion. Some philosophers and moralists grumbled openly about its excess, worrying that citizens spent more on a single vial of imported oil than a soldier earned in a week, that such indulgence signaled a softness unbecoming of Rome's stern founding virtues. These complaints, however, did little to slow the trade, and shops selling scented oils continued to thrive in nearly every corner of the city. For the ordinary Roman, unable to afford imported saffron or rare resins, simpler pleasures sufficed. A few crushed bay leaves added to plain oil, or a sprig of local lavender left steeping for several days, enough to lift a modest household's evening ritual into something faintly special, however humble the ingredients. As evening settles fully now over the city, small braziers begin to glow in windows throughout the insulae, some burning cheap tallow, others, in wealthier homes, releasing the faint sweetness of scented oil warmed gently over a flame. The air itself seems to soften, the harsher smells of the day's labor giving way, slowly, to something gentler, something intentional, a quiet reminder that even amid dust and crowding and the endless demands of city life, the Romans never stopped reaching, in their own small ways, for beauty. There is a room the merchant has not yet visited today, one tucked into a quieter corner of the bathhouse complex, or sometimes standing entirely apart from it in its own modest building near the Forum. Unlike the caldarium's steam or the perfumer's careful blends, this room offers no fragrance worth savoring, and yet it remains, in its own strange way, one of the most telling places to understand how Romans truly lived. Picture a long stone bench, curved slightly for comfort, stretching along the wall of a public latrine. Beneath it, cut into the stone at regular intervals, a series of keyhole-shaped openings, spaced closely enough that a dozen people might sit side by side, facing one another across the narrow room. Entirely without partition, entirely without privacy as we would understand the word today, this arrangement surprises most people learning of it for the first time. We assume, instinctively, that such a private act would demand private space. The Romans assumed no such thing. Here, in the public latrine, senators sat beside shopkeepers, strangers exchanged casual conversation, and the whole affair unfolded with the same unhurried social ease as the baths themselves, simply another shared civic space, woven into the rhythm of daily life. Beneath the stone bench, a channel of flowing water ran continuously, fed by the same aqueduct system that supplied the baths and fountains above, carrying waste steadily away toward the larger sewers threading beneath the city. The sound of it, a constant soft rushing beneath the bench, became such a familiar backdrop that most visitors likely stopped noticing it entirely, the way one stops hearing a fountain after sitting near it long enough. A second channel, shallower, ran along the floor directly in front of the bench, and it is here that the true peculiarity of Roman hygiene reveals itself most vividly. Rather than paper or cloth, Romans reached instead for a sponge, mounted on the end of a short wooden stick, kept moist in this shallow trough of running water, shared communally among everyone using the latrine that day. We will return to this sponge, and its stranger implications, in the chapter ahead. For now, simply picture the scene as it unfolds. The merchant, having finished his business at the baths, stops here briefly on his way home, seated comfortably along the bench, exchanging a nod with an elderly man across from him. The two continuing a conversation about grain prices that had begun, coincidentally, near the fountain earlier that same week. The walls of the finer public latrines were sometimes decorated, surprisingly elaborately, with painted frescoes or small niches holding statues of household gods, particularly Fortuna, goddess of luck, invoked here perhaps in gentle acknowledgement of the digestive uncertainties every visitor silently hoped to avoid. Graffiti, too, covered many latrine walls, scratched crudely into plaster by bored or amused visitors, ranging from simple jokes to short poems, an unfiltered glimpse into the ordinary humor of ordinary Romans, preserved accidentally for centuries. Some wealthier households maintained private latrines within their own homes, though these, too, often connected to the same public sewer system running beneath the streets, and offered little more privacy than a small chamber pot might, emptied later by household slaves into the nearest public drain. True architectural privacy, the kind we take utterly for granted today, simply did not exist as a Roman concept, not in this particular corner of daily life. The smell, it must be admitted honestly, was not always pleasant, particularly in the heat of summer, when the flowing water beneath the bench moved more sluggishly and the accumulated waste of a crowded city lingered longer than anyone might wish. Some latrines burned incense near the entrance in a modest attempt to soften the air, though most visitors likely simply accepted the smell as an unavoidable feature of urban life, the same way they accepted crowded streets or the constant background noise of a thriving city. As the merchant rises finally from the bench, nodding once more to his companion across the room, he steps back out into the cooling evening air, the latrine's low murmur of conversation fading behind him, already replaced in his thoughts by the simple, ordinary business of walking home before darkness settles fully over the winding streets of Rome. We left a small detail unexamined in the latrine, tucked quietly beside the flowing channel at the bather's feet, a sponge, mounted on the end of a short wooden stick, resting in shallow running water. It deserves, now, its own careful attention, because few objects from Roman daily life provoke quite so much modern fascination, and quite so much modern discomfort, as this humble tool. The instrument itself was called, in Latin, a tussorium, and its function was straightforward enough. After finishing one's business on the stone bench above, a visitor would reach for the sponge, use it as we might use paper today, then rinse it briefly in the flowing water at the base of the trough before returning it to its resting place for the next visitor to use in turn. This is the detail that tends to stop modern audiences cold. The sponge was shared. Not privately owned, not carried home, not replaced after each use, but held communally by the latrine itself, passed from stranger to stranger throughout the day, rinsed only briefly between each use in water that, however continuously flowing, was doing considerably less sanitizing work than any modern visitor might hope. It is worth pausing here, not to dwell in discomfort, but simply to sit with how differently the Romans understood the boundary between private and shared. We have already seen this same principle at work in the baths, where strangers soak together in common pools, and in the latrine itself, where privacy barely existed as a concept at all. The shared sponge simply extended this same communal logic one step further, into territory that feels, to modern sensibilities, considerably more intimate. Some historians believe the vinegar or salt water sometimes added to the trough's flowing water served a modest antiseptic purpose, a small acknowledgement, perhaps, that the Romans were not entirely unaware of the practical concerns such sharing might raise. Whether this genuinely reduced illness, or simply offered a small psychological comfort to those using it, remains difficult to say with certainty. This many centuries later, there existed, too, a memorable phrase that has survived from Roman writing, referencing this very sponge, used by the philosopher Seneca in recounting the story of a gladiator who, rather than face death in the arena, chose to end his own life using the very stick meant for this humble tool. A grim anecdote that nonetheless confirms just how ordinary, how unremarkable, this object was considered in daily Roman life, familiar enough to serve as a dark punchline in a philosopher's writing. Wealthier households sometimes kept their own private sponge, avoiding the communal version found in public latrines entirely, a small luxury not unlike maintaining a private bath rather than visiting the crowded public ones. For most ordinary citizens, however, the shared tussorium remained simply a fact of daily life, no more remarkable than sharing a fountain's water or a bathhouse's pool. Not every account agrees on precisely how universal this practice was across the empire. Some regions, and some periods, show evidence of other materials used instead, including moss, or simply smooth stones kept for the purpose, particularly in areas where sea sponges proved difficult or expensive to import. Rome's vast size meant hygiene practices varied considerably between a wealthy household in the capital and a modest farming settlement in a distant province. What remains consistent, though, across nearly every account, is the underlying Roman comfort with shared resources, shared spaces, shared tools, extended even into corners of life that later centuries would insist on making rigidly private and individual. It reflects, in its own small and strange way, a broader truth about how differently one civilization can draw the lines between self and community compared to another. As the evening settles further over the city, the latrine behind the merchant grows quieter, the last visitors of the day finishing their business before heading home through streets now softened by the deepening dusk. The sponge rests once more in its shallow trough, waiting patiently for morning, for the next stranger who will reach for it without a second thought, carrying forward a practice that, however unusual it seems to us now, worked well enough for the people who trusted it, day after ordinary day, for centuries. Beneath the merchant's feet, beneath the latrine's stone bench and the bathhouse's warm floors, beneath the entire sprawling weight of the city itself, another Rome exists, one few citizens ever thought to consider as they walked above it. This is the hidden Rome, the underground one, a vast and largely unseen system built to carry away everything the city above could not keep. It began, as so much in Rome did, with a problem too large to ignore. A city of hundreds of thousands, packed tightly into narrow streets and towering insulae, produces waste at a scale no ancient settlement had truly confronted before. Left unmanaged, it threatens not just comfort but survival itself, disease spreading swiftly through crowded, unsanitary conditions. The Romans understood this, perhaps not in the precise medical terms we would use today, but through simple, hard-earned observation, that a city drowning in its own filth was a city inviting sickness and ruin. Their answer, built gradually over centuries, was a network of channels and tunnels running beneath nearly every major street, carrying waste from public latrines, from private households, from workshops and markets, steadily downward and outward, away from the places people lived and gathered. Some of these channels were modest, simple stone-lined trenches covered with flat paving stones. Others grew large enough, in the oldest and most central parts of the city, for a person to walk through upright, their footsteps echoing softly against damp stone walls. This was not a system built all at once by some single grand decree. It grew organically, over generations, expanded and repaired as the city itself expanded, each engineer and magistrate adding their own small contribution to something far larger than any one person's vision. Where earlier channels proved too narrow, later ones widened them. Where waste collected too easily in slow-moving water, engineers adjusted the gradient, coaxing the flow to move more swiftly, more completely, down toward the river. The river itself played its part here too, quietly, continuously. Waste carried through the tunnels eventually emptied into the Tiber, the water carrying it onward, away from the city, dispersing what the streets above had shed. It was not a perfect solution, not by the standards we would demand today, and the river itself bore the burden of the city's excess in ways that likely affected its own health and clarity. But for its time, the sheer scale of the effort represented something genuinely remarkable, a civilization choosing, deliberately, to build infrastructure for a problem most ancient cities simply endured. Not everyone in Rome enjoyed equal access to this hidden system. The grandest sewers connected primarily to public buildings, temples, and the homes of the wealthy, their private latrines draining directly into the network below. Ordinary households, particularly those in the crowded upper floors of insulae, often relied instead on chamber pots, emptied by hand into the street below or into designated collection points, a task usually left to slaves or the household's poorest members. This practice created its own quiet hazards. Laws existed, and were occasionally enforced, against simply dumping waste from an upper window without warning, a practice apparently common enough to require specific legal attention. Pedestrians below learned, through necessity, to walk with a certain wariness near the base of tall buildings, particularly in early morning hours when households were most likely to empty the night's accumulation. Maintenance of the larger tunnels fell to dedicated workers, sometimes slaves, sometimes hired laborers, whose task involved the unglamorous but essential work of clearing blockages, repairing collapsed sections, and ensuring the constant flow beneath the city continued uninterrupted. Theirs was work rarely celebrated, rarely even acknowledged by the citizens whose comfort depended entirely on it continuing, quietly, in the dark, day after day. As night falls fully now over the city, the sound of the merchant's footsteps echoes softly along the street, entirely unaware of the vast hidden world moving steadily beneath him, water and waste alike carried onward through channels built by hands long since turned to dust. Engineering that would, in various forms, outlast the empire that built it, buried quietly beneath the modern streets that would one day rise above these same ancient foundations. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an engineer's mind when standing before a genuinely difficult problem, one requiring not just labor but vision, not just effort but imagination stretched across decades. Somewhere in Rome's early history, long before the merchant's grandfather's grandfather walked these same streets, such minds faced precisely this challenge, and the solution they devised would come to define the entire city's relationship with water for centuries. The aqueducts themselves, when finally understood in full, reveal an almost stubborn elegance. Water does not flow uphill, and Rome's engineers knew this as certainly as they knew anything, yet the city needed water carried across valleys, around hills, over distances sometimes stretching more than 50 miles from mountain springs to the heart of the capital. Their solution relied on nothing more exotic than careful, patient calculation, a gentle and continuous downward slope maintained across the entire length of each channel, so gradual that a traveler walking alongside it might never notice the descent at all, yet precise enough that water would keep moving, steadily, mile after mile, guided purely by gravity's quiet insistence. Where valleys interrupted this careful slope, the Romans built bridges, the great arched aqueduct structures now familiar even to those who know little else of Roman engineering, stone arches marching across open countryside, carrying their hidden channel of water high above fields and rivers below. Where hills blocked the path entirely, tunnels were carved directly through solid rock, dug from both directions simultaneously by teams of laborers who somehow, through careful surveying, met correctly in the darkness at the tunnel center. Once within the city itself, this carefully guided water dispersed through a network almost as impressive as the aqueducts that fed it. Lead and terracotta pipes carried water beneath the streets, feeding public fountains at regular intervals throughout every neighborhood, ensuring even the poorest citizen, unable to afford a private connection, lived within a short walk of clean, flowing water. The wealthy paid for private pipes running directly into their homes, a luxury reserved for those who could afford both the connection fee and the ongoing maintenance such privilege required. This same system fed the baths, of course, the grand pools and warm chambers we have already wandered through. And it fed the public latrines too, that constant flowing channel beneath the stone bench existing only because this larger network delivered water reliably enough to sustain it. Nothing in Roman hygiene functioned independently. Every warm bath, every flowing latrine channel, every fountain where neighbors gathered each morning, all of it traced back to these same distant mountain springs, carried patiently across miles of careful stonework. The sewers, meanwhile, worked in quiet partnership with this incoming water, using its steady flow not just for drinking and bathing but for the essential work of carrying waste away afterward. This was, in its own way, the true genius of the system. Not simply bringing water in, but using that same water's movement to solve the opposite problem, waste flowing out along channels engineered with the same careful attention to gradient and flow that guided the aqueducts themselves. Maintaining all of this required constant vigilance. Officials called curators aquarum oversaw the aqueducts specifically, tasked with inspecting channels for damage, addressing illegal taps where enterprising citizens occasionally drilled unauthorized connections to avoid paying proper fees, and coordinating the ongoing repairs any system of this scale inevitably required. It was unglamorous work, rarely remembered by history in the way military victories or grand monuments were remembered, yet without it, the entire elaborate structure of Roman hygiene we have wandered through in previous chapters would have simply, quietly, collapsed. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of coordination this represented. Thousands of laborious across generations, surveyors calculating gradients with remarkably simple tools, engineers solving problems of pressure and flow through patient trial and careful observation rather than any formal understanding of hydraulics as later centuries would develop it. And all of it aimed not at conquest, not at grandeur for its own sake, but at something far more intimate, ensuring that an ordinary baker's apprentice, filling his jug each morning at the corner fountain, never had to think twice about where that water came from, or where, eventually, it would go. As night deepens further over the city, the aqueducts continue their silent work unseen. Water still moving steadily along channels built centuries before anyone currently living had drawn their first breath. Carrying forward a promise made long ago by builders who understood, perhaps better than most, that true engineering often serves not the loudest, most visible needs, but the quietest, most constant ones. Somewhere near the edge of the merchant's neighborhood, tucked between a bakery and a cramped row of workshops, stands a building unlike any we have visited so far, one that greets visitors not with steam or fountain spray but with a smell sharp enough to make newcomers wrinkle their noses before they even step through the door. This is the Falarnica, the laundry, and its methods, more than almost anything else we have encountered, reveal just how differently the Romans approached the boundary between clean and unclean. Inside, a row of shallow stone basins lines the floor, each large enough for a person to stand within, submerged to the calves in liquid that carries an unmistakable, pungent odor. This is not water alone. It is water mixed generously with urine, collected deliberately from public latrines and even from large jars left standing on street corners specifically for this purpose. Citizens encouraged, sometimes even paid, to contribute rather than simply emptying such waste elsewhere. The reasoning behind this, however strange it sounds to modern ears, rested on sound if unrefined chemistry. Urine, left to age, breaks down into ammonia, a substance remarkably effective at cutting through grease, lifting stains, and brightening dull fabric in ways plain water alone could never manage. The fullers, the workers of this trade, understood this through generations of accumulated practical knowledge. Long before anyone could explain the underlying science behind why it worked so reliably. A young fuller, barely more than a boy, stands in one such basin now, treading rhythmically upon a heap of woolen cloth submerged beneath him, his bare feet working the fabric against the stone floor in a steady, practiced dance. This treading served the same essential purpose a modern washing machine's agitation serves today, working the cleaning liquid deep into the fibers, loosening dirt and oil accumulated through weeks of wear. The work was neither quick nor gentle. Hours might pass with this same rhythmic treading, the boy's legs aching, his breathing settling into the same steady pattern as his feet, until finally the fuller judged the fabric sufficiently cleaned. Only then would the cloth be lifted, wrung firmly by hand, and rinsed repeatedly in clean water drawn from the same aqueduct system feeding every other corner of the city's hygiene. What followed next required its own particular skill. The cloth, still damp, was stretched carefully across a wicker frame shaped somewhat like a cage, and beneath this frame, a small pot of burning sulfur was placed, its fumes rising up through the fabric above. This process, called sulfuring, brightened white wool in particular, restoring a crispness and pale color that repeated wear and washing gradually dulled, a final touch that separated ordinary clean clothing from truly presentable clothing, fit for public appearance, the finished garments. Once fully dried and brushed smooth, carried a faint lingering scent, not entirely unpleasant despite their unusual treatment, something closer to clean stone and fresh air than anything reminiscent of the basins where they began their journey. Citizens dropped off their finest togas here regularly, particularly before important public occasions, trusting the fuller's rough methods to return their garments looking crisp, pale, and appropriately dignified. This trade, unglamorous as it was, held a peculiar importance within Roman commerce. Emperors occasionally taxed the collection of urine specifically for this purpose, recognizing its genuine economic value rather than dismissing it as mere waste. One emperor, when questioned about the propriety of taxing something so undignified, reportedly remarked that money, regardless of its source, carried no scent of where it came from, a wry observation that has outlived him by nearly 2,000 years. Ordinary households, unable to afford professional fullers for everyday garments, often managed simpler laundry themselves, using plain water and vigorous scrubbing against stone, saving the fuller's specialized treatment for finer wool or particularly important occasions. Even so, the falanica remained a familiar fixture in nearly every Roman neighborhood, its sharp smell simply another thread woven into the city's complex, layered atmosphere. As dusk settles fully now, the young fuller finally steps from his basin, legs trembling slightly from hours of steady treading, and begins the careful work of wringing and hanging the day's finished garments along wooden racks near the doorway, where the last warm air of evening might help finish what hours of labor had already mostly accomplished. Another small, unglamorous piece of the vast, quiet machinery keeping Rome's citizens presentable, day after ordinary day. We have already glimpsed, in the fuller's basin, one particular use for a substance most modern audiences would rather not discuss at length. But laundry, it turns out, was merely the most visible application of a practice that ran considerably deeper through Roman daily life, touching trades and habits far beyond the workshop we just left behind. Consider, for a moment, how differently the Romans categorized the world around them. We tend to sort substances neatly into waste and resource, into unclean and useful, rarely allowing much overlap between these categories. The Romans, ever practical, drew these lines rather differently, guided less by instinctive disgust than by careful, accumulated observation of what actually worked. Urine's usefulness extended well beyond brightening woolen togas. Tanners, working leather in workshops often situated near the same districts as the fullers, relied on it too, its ammonia content proving equally effective at breaking down the tough fibers of raw animal hide, softening it into something workable, something that could eventually become sandals, belts, or the sturdy leather satchels merchants carried through the forum each day. Even dental care, a subject we will explore more fully in a coming chapter, occasionally intersected with this same practical resource. Certain accounts, admittedly debated among historians, suggest some Romans used diluted urine as a mouth rinse. believing its properties helped whiten teeth and freshen breath, a practice that later Roman writers themselves sometimes mocked, particularly directing this mockery towards certain provinces reputed to favor the habit more enthusiastically than Rome's own citizens preferred. Metalworkers, too, found uses for it in their trade, employing it in certain cleaning and polishing processes for bronze and other metals, its mild acidity helping cut through tarnish and oxidation that accumulated on tools and decorative items left exposed to the humid Mediterranean air. A craftsman polishing a bronze mirror for a wealthy client's household might reach for the same basic substance a fuller used on woolen cloth, each trade adapting this humble resource to its own particular needs. This widespread usefulness created, inevitably, its own small economy. Large jars stood on many street corners throughout Roman cities, placed there specifically to collect contributions from passers-by. Later gathered and sold to fullers, tanners, and others who required it for their trades. Citizens occasionally contributed simply out of civic habit, others more deliberately, aware that certain workshops paid modestly for particularly large or frequent contributions. The emperor's decision to tax this trade, mentioned briefly before, reflected just how significant this humble economy had become. What began as simple waste, something every citizen produced without thought or effort, transformed through this careful collection and sale into genuine commercial value, taxed and regulated alongside far more conventional Roman industries. There existed, too, a certain matter-of-fact acceptance surrounding all of this that feels genuinely foreign to modern sensibilities. We might expect embarrassment, or at least reluctance, surrounding such practices, yet Roman writers discuss the fulling trade and its methods with the same straightforward practicality they applied to grain prices or road construction, simply another feature of a functioning, thoughtfully organized city. Not every Roman embraced this practice without complaint, of course. Certain satirists occasionally mocked the fulling trade's less pleasant aspects, and the pungent smell surrounding these workshops likely drew its share of wrinkled noses from passers-by, much as it might from a modern visitor stepping unexpectedly through the Falarnica's doorway. But complaint rarely translated into genuine reform, the practice simply too useful, too economically embedded, to abandon for the sake of finer sensibilities. As evening settles further over the merchant's neighborhood, the collection jars standing quietly at street corners continue their patient work, waiting for tomorrow's contributions, another small thread in the vast, interconnected fabric of a city that had long since learned to find genuine value in even its most unglamorous byproducts, transforming what many civilizations would simply discard into something Rome had learned, through centuries of practical necessity, to consider genuinely worth keeping. There is a particular kind of vanity that transcends centuries entirely unchanged, and nowhere does this become clearer than in the small, careful attention Romans paid to their teeth. Long before mirrors of polished silver revealed every flaw to a critical eye, before dinner parties demanded a confident smile across a crowded triclinium, Romans had already developed their own particular rituals for keeping their mouths clean, their breath tolerable, and their teeth, however imperfectly presentable. The tools available to them differed enormously from anything we would recognize today. Yet the underlying instinct feels remarkably familiar. A simple twig, its end frayed and softened by chewing, served as an early kind of toothbrush, rubbed gently along the teeth and gums each morning, dislodging the previous day's remnants of bread and wine. Wealthier households sometimes preferred a small linen cloth instead, wrapped around a finger and used to wipe the teeth clean, occasionally dipped first in a fine, gritty powder meant to help scrub away stubborn residue. This powder, called dentifricium, varied considerably depending on what a household could afford. The simplest versions relied on nothing more than finely crushed pumice, an abrasive volcanic stone ground down until it resembled coarse sand, effective enough at polishing teeth but rough enough, used too vigorously, to wear away at the enamel beneath. Wealthier recipes grew more elaborate, incorporating crushed eggshell, ground oyster shell, or even powdered horn. Each recipe passed quietly between households, refined slightly with each generation's small adjustments. And then, inevitably, we return once more to a substance we have already encountered twice in this story. Certain accounts suggest some Romans genuinely did rinse their mouths with diluted urine, believing, much as with the fuller's basin, that its properties helped brighten teeth and combat the persistent problem of bad breath. This practice, whatever its actual effectiveness, became something of a cultural marker, with Roman writers occasionally mocking rival provinces, particularly certain regions of Hispania, for their reported enthusiasm toward this particular remedy, suggesting that even genuine hygiene practices could become fodder for gentle regional teasing among Romans themselves. Bad breath, called halitosis by physicians even then, drew considerable attention in Roman medical writing, with numerous remedies proposed across different sources. Chewing fresh herbs, particularly mint or parsley, offered a simpler, more immediately pleasant solution than the mouth rinses mentioned above, and small sprigs of such herbs were sometimes carried specifically for this purpose, chewed casually throughout the day, much as one might today reach for a small mint before an important conversation. Toothaches, when they inevitably arrived, brought considerably less pleasant remedies. Without the anesthetics and precise dental tools later centuries would develop, Roman physicians relied on a combination of herbal remedies meant to numb pain. Sometimes clove oil, sometimes other aromatic extracts believed to dull the ache temporarily, alongside more drastic measures when infection or decay had progressed too far to ignore. Extraction, performed with simple metal tools and considerable courage on the patient's part, remained the final, unavoidable option for teeth beyond saving. Remarkably, Roman dentistry also developed early forms of dental prosthetics, particularly among the wealthy. Bridges made from gold wire, anchoring a false tooth, often carved from ivory or taken from an animal, between two natural teeth, allowed those who could afford such craftsmanship to disguise the gaps left by extraction or decay, restoring both function and, perhaps more importantly to Roman sensibilities, appearance. Teeth themselves, examined by archaeologists in the centuries since, reveal a population whose dental health varied enormously by class and diet, much as their bathing habits. Did the wealthy, indulging regularly in honey-sweetened dishes and imported delicacies, often suffered more cavities than their poorer counterparts, whose simpler, coarser diet of bread and vegetables proved, inadvertently, gentler on their teeth, as the merchant settles finally into his own home for the evening, running his tongue briefly across his teeth from habit. He thinks little of the particular history behind this small daily ritual, the twig and powder waiting by his bedside exactly as they had every morning of his life. One more small, quiet inheritance from centuries of Romans before him, each generation refining, however modestly, this most personal and persistent corner of daily hygiene. Somewhere near the Forum, tucked between a wine shop and a shuttered stall selling pottery, a barber's small storefront glows faintly with the last light of the afternoon, a single lamp already lit against the deepening shadows inside. This is the Tunsus domain, and for many Roman men, a visit here counted among the small, necessary rituals that punctuated an ordinary week, as familiar and expected as a trip to the baths themselves. Roman attitudes toward facial hair shifted considerably across the centuries, following fashion as much as any modern trend might. In the earlier days of the Republic, Beards were common, practical, largely unremarkable. But by the time of the merchant's own lifetime, clean-shaven faces had become the dominant fashion among citizens who could afford regular barbering, a smooth jaw signaling not just personal grooming but a certain social respectability, an adherence to current taste that mattered more than most would openly admit. The barber's tools, laid carefully across a small wooden table, included a straight iron razor, its blade requiring frequent sharpening against a whetstone kept close at hand, along with small metal tweezers for plucking stray hairs, and a simple bronze mirror, its polished surface offering a dim, slightly warped reflection to any customer wishing to inspect the barber's work before leaving. Shaving itself, performed without any lathering soap as we would recognize it, relied instead on water alone, sometimes warmed slightly, applied generously to soften the skin before the blade's careful work began. This made for a process considerably more perilous than any modern shave, the razor's edge dragging against dry or barely dampened stubble, nicks and small cuts common enough that barbershops kept spider webs, believe it or not, soaked in oil and vinegar, pressed against fresh wounds as a rough but apparently effective method of stopping the bleeding. A young man, newly arrived in the city from a smaller provincial town, sits now in the barber's single chair, visibly tense as the blade moves carefully along his jaw. This is not simply grooming for him, but transformation, the shedding of a rural, unfashionable beard in favor of the smooth, urbane appearance he believes will help him navigate Rome's crowded, competitive streets more successfully. The barber works in practiced silence, occasionally pausing to wipe the blade clean, his experienced hands moving with the confidence of 1,000 previous customers. Hair, too, received considerable attention here, cut and styled according to whatever fashion currently dominated the city's elite. Certain emperors' particular hairstyles, once adopted by the imperial court, rippled outward through Roman society with surprising speed, ordinary citizens requesting barbers replicate whatever the emperor himself currently favored. A strange and ancient precursor to the way modern celebrities might influence popular style centuries later. Beyond simple cutting and shaving, the Tunzer's shop often served, much like the baths themselves, as an informal gathering place, men lingering after their own grooming to exchange news, discuss politics, or simply pass idle time in conversation while waiting their turn. The barber himself, hearing snippets of gossip from every corner of the city throughout his working day, often became something of an informal news source, customers arriving as much for conversation as for the blade's careful work. Women's hair, by contrast, rarely fell under the Tunzer's direct care, tended instead by household slaves trained specifically in elaborate styling, braiding, and the careful application of pins and combs necessary to achieve whatever elaborate arrangement current fashion demanded. Particularly among wealthier households where a woman's hairstyle might shift as dramatically with the seasons as her wardrobe, as the young provincial man finally rises from the barber's chair, running an unfamiliar hand across his newly smooth jaw, something in his posture shifts, a small but genuine confidence settling over him that had not been there when he first sat down. The barber sweeps away the fallen hair with practiced efficiency, already glancing toward the next customer waiting patiently near the doorway, the day's work continuing steadily onward into the gathering dusk. In a quiet upper room of a wealthy household not far from the barber's shop, a woman sits before a small polished bronze mirror, her attendant standing patiently at her side, a tray of small clay pots and delicate glass vials arranged carefully on the table between them. This is the ornatrix's domain, the household slave trained specifically in the arts of cosmetics and appearance, and the ritual unfolding here, unhurried and deliberate, reveals another layer entirely of how Romans understood the presentation of the self, pale skin, unmarked by the sun's harshness, signaled leisure and status among Roman women, a visible sign that one's days were spent indoors, tending to household affairs rather than laboring beneath the open sky. To achieve this, many turned to a whitening paste, often made from chalk or, more troublingly by later medical understanding, from lead carbonate, ground fine and mixed into a smooth cream applied carefully across the face and neck. The ornatrix works this pale mixture now across her mistress's cheeks with practiced, gentle strokes, blending it evenly toward the hairline, careful not to leave visible lines where the cosmetic ended and natural skin began. Neither woman in the room fully understands, of course, the slow harm certain of these preparations might carry, leads toxic effects unknown to Roman medicine, though some physicians did express vague unease about preparations that seemed, over years of use, to leave skin looking strangely aged despite their promise of youthful brightness. Color came next, applied with far more visible intention than the pale base beneath it. Red ochre or crushed mulberry, mixed into a soft paste, colored the cheeks and lips alike, a warm flush meant to suggest vitality and health against the deliberately pale canvas of the face. Some women preferred a more subtle application, while others, particularly those attending grand social occasions, favored a bolder, more visible flush, current fashion shifting the acceptable intensity much as it shifted acceptable hemlines or hairstyles. Eyes received their own careful attention. Dark kohl applied along the lash line and lower lid, made from soot or crushed antimony mixed with oil, meant to widen and darken the eyes, drawing attention toward them in a crowded room or across a dinner party's low lamplight. Eyebrows, too, followed fashion's particular demands, with some women favoring a single, unbroken line across the brow, achieved through careful darkening with the same kohl mixture, believing this dramatic feature suggested a striking, memorable beauty. Beyond color and paste, Roman cosmetics extended into subtler territories as well. Small beauty marks, sometimes natural, sometimes deliberately applied with a dab of dark paste, drew the eye toward a particularly favored feature, a strategically placed mark near the lips or cheek considered charming rather than a flaw to hide. Perfumed oils. The same we encountered earlier drifting through the unguentarius's shop, finished the ritual, dabbed lightly at the wrists and throat, a final invisible layer completing the visible transformation already achieved. Men, too, though generally with far less elaborate ritual than their female counterparts, paid some attention to appearance beyond simple barbering. Subtle oils kept skin from appearing too weathered by sun and wind, and certain fashionable men, much to the disapproval of more traditional moralists, occasionally experimented with lighter cosmetic touches of their own, blurring lines that stricter observers preferred to keep firmly separate between masculine and feminine grooming. Roman writers, particularly poets, left behind considerable commentary on these cosmetic rituals, some mocking gently the elaborate hours certain women devoted to achieving what appeared, ultimately, as effortless natural beauty. The labor itself meant to remain invisible, hidden behind the finished result presented finally to the world outside the private dressing room. As the ornatrix steps back finally to examine her completed work, her mistress studies her own transformed reflection in the dim bronze mirror, the pale skin and reddened cheeks and darkened eyes staring back at her, a face simultaneously her own and something carefully, deliberately constructed, ready now for whatever evening gathering awaits beyond these quiet walls. There is a particular corner of Roman daily life that survives, frustratingly, in far less detail than nearly everything we have explored so far, not because it mattered less, but because so much of what shaped a Roman woman's private world was simply never thought worth recording by the male historians and poets who left behind most of what we know today. What fragments remain, gathered carefully from medical writings, private letters, and the occasional passing reference, offer only a partial window into this quieter, more hidden side of Roman hygiene. Menstruation, understood today through clear medical knowledge, carried among Romans a curious mixture of practical acceptance and superstition. Physicians of the era, drawing heavily on earlier Greek medical tradition, believed menstrual blood served an essential function in maintaining a woman's health, a natural and necessary release rather than something to be feared or hidden entirely. Yet alongside this practical understanding ran considerably stranger beliefs, agricultural writers occasionally warning that a menstruating woman's presence near crops or wine could spoil them, superstitions that likely shaped certain social customs more than any genuine medical concern did. For managing this monthly reality, Roman women relied primarily on simple folded cloth, wool or linen, washed and reused much as any other household textile. An unglamorous but entirely practical solution consistent with the resourceful, reusable approach to fabric we have already seen in the fuller's careful handling of woolen garments. Wealthier households likely possessed finer cloth set aside specifically for this purpose, while poorer women made do with whatever fabric scraps their household could spare. Pregnancy and childbirth, too, brought their own particular attention to cleanliness. Midwives, called obstetrics, overseeing not just the birth itself but considerable practical guidance around washing and recovery in the days following. Warm water, gently applied, featured prominently in postpartum care, alongside various herbal preparations believed to ease healing and prevent the infections that, tragically, claimed a significant number of new mothers regardless of how carefully such precautions were followed. Beyond these more private matters, Roman women shared much of the same daily hygiene rhythm we have already traced through the merchant's own routine. The baths, though sometimes segregated by gender or by specific hours reserved for women, offered the same warm water, the same oil and strigil ritual, the same social gathering space that men enjoyed, though women's access to certain grander bath complexes occasionally faced more restriction than men's did, depending on the particular city, era, and the personal preferences of whichever official happened to oversee local bathing customs. Certain wealthy women, unwilling to share space with men entirely, or simply preferring privacy, maintained private bathing facilities within their own homes, small heated rooms modeled after the public bathhouses but scaled down considerably, accessible only to the household's own family and closest guests. For most women, however, the public bath remained as central to daily life as they were for their husbands and brothers. Simply another thread in the shared communal fabric of the city. Pubic and body hair, too, received attention according to the fashion of the particular era, certain periods favoring complete removal among women who could afford the process, achieved through a combination of pumice stone, tweezers, or a thick depilatory paste made from resin and other ingredients, applied and then pulled away, taking hair with it in a process that likely proved as uncomfortable as it sounds. Other eras favored less rigorous standards. Fashion here, as in so much of Roman life, shifting unpredictably across generations. What emerges from these scattered fragments, incomplete as they remain, is a picture of Roman women navigating their own hygiene with the same practical resourcefulness. The same blend of genuine care and occasional superstition that shaped every other corner of Roman daily life we have wandered through so far. Their private rituals, though recorded far less thoroughly by the historians of their own time, mattered just as deeply to the women who practiced them, quiet routines carried out largely beyond the notice of the male writers who otherwise documented so much of Roman existence. As evening settles further still over the city, somewhere behind a closed door in an ordinary household, a woman finishes her own quiet evening ritual. Unremarked and unrecorded, one more small, private thread woven invisibly into the vast, layered history of a city that, for all its grand monuments and celebrated engineering, was ultimately built from countless such ordinary, largely unwritten moments. Far beyond the merchants' familiar streets, along the empire's distant frontiers, an entirely different rhythm of hygiene unfolds each day, one shaped not by the leisurely comfort of the bathhouse but by the harder, more disciplined demands of military life. Here, along a river marking the edge of Roman territory, a legionary fortress rises from the surrounding landscape, its walls enclosing thousands of soldiers whose daily habits reveal Rome's hygiene ethics stretched, adapted, and applied under considerably harsher conditions. It might surprise those who imagine military camps as inevitably crude and unsanitary to learn that Roman legions carried their bathing customs with them wherever they marched, considering clean water and proper washing facilities every bit as essential to military effectiveness as weapons or fortifications. A permanent fortress, established for extended occupation, almost always included its own bathhouse, smaller and more utilitarian than the grand civic baths of Rome itself, but built according to the same fundamental principles: heated rooms, oil and strigil, careful engineering to supply and drain water reliably. A soldier stationed here, finishing a long day of drilling and fortification work, approaches this modest bathhouse now, mud and sweat clinging to skin already toughened by months of frontier service. Inside, the same familiar ritual awaits, though performed with military efficiency rather than the unhurried leisure enjoyed by wealthier citizens back in the capital. Officers, generally, allowed themselves and their men limited time for such comforts, the day's demanding schedule rarely permitting the lingering, hours-long baths common in civilian life. Even on the march, far from any permanent fortress, Roman military engineering found ways to maintain basic hygiene standards. Legions constructing temporary camps each evening, a routine practiced with remarkable discipline throughout even the longest campaigns, typically dug latrine trenches at the camp's edge, positioned carefully downwind and downhill from the sleeping quarters, a practical measure born from hard experience about disease and its rapid spread through crowded, unsanitary conditions. Roman military medical officers, called medici, understood, even without modern germ theory, that unclean conditions bred sickness among densely packed soldiers, and camp regulations reflected this understanding through strict, consistently enforced sanitation requirements. Soldiers found violating these basic hygiene rules, relieving themselves carelessly near sleeping quarters or water sources, faced genuine disciplinary consequences. Commanders recognizing that an army weakened by disease posed as serious a threat as any enemy force encountered on the battlefield. Water supply for marching legions received similarly careful attention, engineers scouting each day's route specifically for reliable water sources, streams or springs capable of supporting thousands of soldiers and their accompanying pack animals. Where natural sources proved insufficient or unreliable, temporary wells were sometimes dug, another small example of the same practical engineering ingenuity that built Rome's grand aqueducts applied instead to the immediate, urgent needs of an army on the move. Personal grooming, too, held particular significance within military culture, a soldier's appearance considered a visible marker of discipline and unit pride. Regulations generally required short, practical hairstyles, easier to maintain in the field and less vulnerable to an enemy's grip during close combat, while beards, depending on the particular era and unit tradition, might be either carefully maintained or shaved entirely clean, following whatever standard the current commanding officer preferred to enforce. the equipment soldiers carried reflected this same practical attention to cleanliness. Small strigils, simplified versions of those used in civilian bathhouses, appeared among many soldiers' personal kit. Along with basic oils for skin care, particularly valued during harsh frontier winters when dry, cracked skin posed a genuine practical concern rather than merely a cosmetic one. Archaeological finds along old Roman frontiers have uncovered these same small strigils buried alongside weapons and armor, quiet evidence of hygiene's continued importance even amid the harsher realities of military existence. As darkness settles now over the frontier fortress, the soldier finishes his abbreviated bath, dressing quickly in the cooling evening air before returning to his barracks for the night's rest. Tomorrow will bring another day of drilling, another evening of this same efficient ritual. A smaller, harder echo of the leisurely baths enjoyed back in Rome itself, yet carrying forward the same fundamental belief that shaped so much of Roman life, that cleanliness, however differently achieved, remained essential to maintaining not just comfort, but genuine strength and discipline. Return, for a moment, to the merchant we first met wandering through this hidden Rome, oil and steam and strigil marking his path through an ordinary evening's ritual. His experience, comfortable and unhurried as it seemed, represented only one particular version of Roman hygiene, a version shaped considerably by means he possessed that vast numbers of Rome's inhabitants simply did not consider. First, the water itself, that essential resource threading through every ritual we have explored. A wealthy senator's villa connected directly to the aqueduct system through private lead pipes, water flowing conveniently into his own home, into his own private bath if he preferred one, without ever requiring him to walk further than his own courtyard. An ordinary resident of a crowded insula, by contrast, walked to the corner fountain each morning, jug in hand, waiting patiently among neighbors for their turn at the same shared, if reliable, public spout. This difference in access rippled outward through nearly every aspect of daily hygiene we have traced. Where the wealthy might bathe daily, sometimes twice, using their own private facilities or paying for the finest hours at the grandest public baths, poorer citizens often bathed less frequently, constrained by both time and the practical burden of hauling water or affording even the bath's modest entrance fee, small as it generally remained. The oils themselves told a similar story of quiet inequality. We have already glimpsed the perfumer's shop, its shelves lined with rose and saffron and imported myrrh, prices reflecting ingredients gathered from distant provinces at considerable expense. A wealthy woman might own several such scented oils, each reserved for particular occasions, while her poorer counterpart made do with a single jar of plain, locally pressed olive oil, unscented but functional, serving every purpose from cooking to washing to whatever modest grooming her limited time allowed. Housing itself shaped hygiene in ways easy to overlook. The senator's villa offered private latrines, connected directly to the source system. Private washing rooms, ample space for the unhurried rituals of oil and strigil performed by trained household slaves. The upper floors of a crowded insula, several stories above street level, offered none of this, residents relying instead on shared facilities, communal fountains, and the constant, exhausting labor of carrying water up flight after flight of narrow stairs. Even something as simple as personal space affected hygiene considerably. A wealthy household might include a room specifically designated for washing, quiet and private, while a poor family crowded into one or two small rooms had no such luxury. Personal grooming performed wherever space briefly allowed, amid the constant noise and activity of family life lived largely in the open. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine this divide as absolute, poor Romans entirely excluded from hygiene's benefits while the wealthy alone enjoyed genuine cleanliness. The public baths themselves, as we explored earlier, remained remarkably accessible, their modest entrance fee within reach of nearly everyone, senators and shopkeepers alike soaking in the same warm water, however differently they might have arrived there or however different their morning routines had been beforehand. Rome's public infrastructure, whatever its imperfections, extended genuine benefit even to those without private wealth, slaves, occupying perhaps the most difficult position within this entire system. Often possessed even less personal autonomy over their own hygiene than the poorest free citizens, their washing schedules dictated by their households' needs rather than their own preference, their access to baths and private space determined entirely by their owners' willingness to permit such consideration. Some households treated their slaves with genuine care in this regard, while others offered little more than the bare minimum necessary for basic function, as the merchant makes his way home through streets now fully dark, passing beneath windows where oil lamps flicker in wealthier homes and cheaper tallow candles burn in humbler ones, the vast, layered inequality running beneath Rome's shared rituals becomes briefly visible in this small contrast of light and shadow, a reminder that even a city built around genuinely communal spaces like the baths and fountains still divided its citizens, quietly but persistently, along lines that wealth alone could draw. The merchant has reached his own doorway now, the day's long journey through baths and streets and quiet ritual finally drawing toward its close. Before stepping inside, he pauses briefly, as he often does, looking back once more at the city settling into darkness around him, its scattered lights flickering softly across rooftops and narrow lanes, an entire civilization quietly preparing for rest. It would be easy, having wandered through so many strange and unfamiliar practices, to dismiss Roman hygiene as simply primitive, a rough and incomplete precursor to the understanding later centuries would eventually achieve. Yet something worth pausing on emerges clearly, now that we have traced this full journey from morning fountain to evening lamplight. How much of what the Romans built, however differently they explained or understood it, still holds genuine wisdom worth recognizing? Their aqueducts and sewers, engineering marvels born from patient observation rather than formal science, reflected an intuitive understanding that clean water in and dirty water out mattered enormously to a population's health, a principle modern sanitation still rests upon entirely, however more sophisticated our current methods have become. Long before anyone understood bacteria or disease transmission in the terms we use today, Roman engineers had already grasped, through simple practical necessity, that a city drowning in its own waste invited sickness, and built accordingly. Their baths, too, however communal and unfamiliar they might feel to modern sensibilities, understood something we sometimes forget amid our private showers and individual routines, that hygiene need not be a solitary act, that washing could also mean gathering, conversing, resting, a daily ritual woven as much into social and emotional well-being as into physical cleanliness alone. There is a reason, perhaps, that so many cultures since have rediscovered, in various forms, the simple pleasure of communal bathing that Rome perfected so thoroughly centuries ago. Even their stranger practices, the shared sponge, the urine-soaked laundry basins, the diluted mouth rinses that later Romans themselves sometimes mocked, reveal not carelessness but a particular kind of resourcefulness, a willingness to find value and function in whatever materials lay readily at hand, rather than waiting for some more refined solution that centuries of chemistry had not yet made possible. They worked, quite literally, with what they had, and often found ways to make it work remarkably well. Their oil and strigil method, too, deserves a certain quiet respect. Modern dermatology, circling back after centuries of harsh soaps and synthetic cleansers, has increasingly recognized the gentleness of oil-based cleansing, understanding what Roman bathers seemed to grasp instinctively, that stripping skin entirely of its natural oils. However thoroughly it might feel like true cleanliness, often does the body's largest organ more harm than good. What Rome ultimately built, across every practice we have wandered through together, was not some perfect, unified system of hygiene by modern standards, but something perhaps more valuable in its own way, a genuinely thoughtful, deeply integrated relationship between water, community, and the human body, treated not as separate problems requiring separate solutions, but as interconnected threads within one continuous, carefully engineered whole. The merchant steps finally through his own doorway now, the last light of the city's scattered lamps fading behind him as the door closes softly against the night air. Somewhere above him, the same stars that watched over Rome's earliest days continue their slow, patient circle, indifferent to empires rising or falling beneath them, indifferent, too, to whichever particular century happens to be watching from below. Tomorrow, the fountains will fill again with the same morning ritual, the baths will fill again with the same warm water and quiet conversation, and somewhere in the vast, lead machinery beneath the streets, water will continue its steady journey inward, and waste its steady journey outward. Exactly as it has for centuries, exactly as it will continue long after this particular evening has faded quietly into the deeper, gathering dark, and perhaps that is the gentlest truth of all, waiting here at the end of our long walk through ancient Rome. That beneath every grand monument, every famous battle, every emperor's name still remembered across 2,000 years, there remained, always, this quieter rhythm, ordinary people, washing, resting, gathering, simply trying, in whatever way their world allowed, to feel clean, and cared for, and briefly, peacefully, at ease.